Somewhere on the North Atlantic, in the grey and heavy silence of December, there is a ship moving without hands. Its sails are full. The wind is carrying it along as though someone laid a careful course and simply stepped away. The rigging holds. The hull is sound. There is food in the galley. There is cargo in the hold. There are belongings in the cabins. Boots beside a bed, a coat draped over a chair, a child's toy sitting on a shelf as though placed there just moments before. But the ship is empty. No crew, no captain, no sound but water against wood and the low moan of rigging in the wind. This is the Mary Celeste, and it is December the 5th, 1872. No one can explain where the people went. No bodies were ever found, no wreckage from a lifeboat, no distress signal was ever received. No other vessel reported seeing anything unusual in those waters. The people simply vanished, as cleanly and completely as if the ocean had reached up and taken them. For more than 150 years, people have been trying to understand what happened. Scholars, investigators, naval historians, writers, and theorists have all taken their turn. Most of them eventually land in the same frustrated place. They cannot explain it. But there is a version of this story that has never fully been told. Not the ghost ship myth, not the tabloid version. The real version, the one buried in cargo manifests and maritime court records, in the contradictions between what witnesses said and what officials wrote down, in the small and easily overlooked details that, when held together, form a picture far more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. This is the story of the Mary Celeste, and what was inside her that should never have been there at all. Chapter 1. The Perfect Voyage. To understand what happened to the Mary Celeste, you first have to understand what kind of ship she was, and more importantly, what kind of man was in command of her. Benjamin Spooner Briggs was born in 1835 in Wareham, Massachusetts, into a family that had lived alongside the sea for generations. His father was a sea captain. His brothers were sea captains. The ocean was not a mystery to the Briggs family. It was the family business, as familiar and unglamorous as any other trade passed from father to son. Benjamin grew up understanding the rhythms of deep water shipping, the patience it required, the discipline, the careful reading of weather and tide. By the time he was a young man, he had already served aboard multiple vessels and distinguished himself with a reputation that, in the world of maritime commerce, was the most valuable thing a man could own. He was reliable. He was not a reckless man. He was not a drinker. He was not given to emotional outbursts or poor decisions under pressure. Every account of him, from the men who sailed under him, from the merchants who hired him, from the port officials who dealt with him, uses the same cluster of words: careful, steady, professional, trusted. By 1872, Briggs had risen to the point where he had a partial ownership stake in the Mary Celeste herself. This was meaningful. It was not unusual for captains to own shares in their vessels at this period of maritime history, but it was a mark of success, a sign that a man had moved from employee to partner, from labourer to stakeholder. Briggs had skin in the game. He cared about the Mary Celeste not just as a job, but as an investment, as an asset, as something partially his. For the November voyage, Briggs made a decision that was unusual but not unheard of for the era. He brought his family. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, 30 years old, the daughter of a minister, an accomplished musician who brought her small melodeon aboard with her, would be travelling with him, and their daughter, Sophia Matilda, just 2 years old, would be there as well. Their son Arthur was left at home with his grandmother in Massachusetts. He had school. But Sophia was young enough to travel, and Sarah and Benjamin Briggs had made ocean crossings together before. The Mary Celeste was a sound vessel. The cargo was legitimate. The crew was experienced. There was no reason to be afraid. The ship itself had a somewhat tangled history by the time Briggs took command of her. She had been built in Nova Scotia in 1861 under a different name, the Amazon, and had experienced a string of misfortunes in her early years that left some sailors quietly superstitious about her. She had struck a fishing weir on her maiden voyage. She had been involved in a collision. She had changed hands several times before being acquired, renamed, and refitted. By 1872 she was in solid condition, but her reputation among old sailors had a faint shadow on it. Briggs, being a practical man, almost certainly dismissed this as maritime folklore. He had examined the ship. He knew its capabilities. He was not worried. The cargo loaded into the Mary Celeste's hold in New York in the first days of November 1872 was 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol. Specifically, this was denatured industrial alcohol, a substance used in the production of fortified wines, primarily in Italy and the Mediterranean markets. It was being shipped on behalf of Meissner, Ackermann and Company, a respected commercial firm. It was a legitimate contract, documented in the usual way, insured in the usual way, recorded in the usual way, or so it appeared. The crew that Briggs assembled was small, 7 men, plus Briggs himself and his wife and daughter, making 10 people aboard in total. The crew included Albert Richardson, the first mate, who was Briggs's brother-in-law and a trusted associate. Andrew Gilling served as second mate. The cook, Edward Head, was a young man making his first long voyage. The remaining 4 were German sailors, Volkert Lorenzen, Bos Lorenzen, Arian Martens, and Gottlieb Gondescholk. By all accounts, the crew worked smoothly together and had no significant conflicts in the early days of the voyage. The Mary Celeste departed New York on November the 5th, 1872. She was bound for Genoa, Italy. The weather was favourable. The sea was calm. The ship was well provisioned. There was a surplus of food aboard, more than enough for a long voyage, with months of additional supplies if needed. Whatever the final days of that ship looked like, they did not begin in desperation or fear. They began in the ordinary competence of experienced sailors doing their jobs. Briggs wrote one final letter from New York before departure. It was addressed to his mother, and in it he described the weather as pleasant, the crew as satisfactory, the vessel as in fine shape. He expressed hope for a smooth crossing. He wrote with the mild optimism of a man who has made these voyages many times before and expects this one to be no different. He sealed the letter. He posted it. He walked back to his ship. It was the last thing he ever wrote. Chapter 2. The Manifest Irregularities. In any story that involves hidden cargo, the truth tends to reveal itself in paperwork, not in dramatic confessions or deathbed revelations, but in the quiet, bureaucratic language of ledgers and manifests, in numbers that don't quite line up, in signatures that appear where they shouldn't, in descriptions that are just vague enough to be meaningless if you aren't looking closely and incriminating if you are. The cargo manifest for the Mary Celeste's 1872 voyage listed 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol. This is a specific number, carefully recorded. But when investigators later examined the physical barrels that were recovered with the ship, they found something that should have prompted far more scrutiny than it received. 9 of the barrels were empty, not damaged, not leaking, simply empty. And 17 of the barrels were made from red oak rather than the white oak that was standard for this type of cargo. This matters because white oak is nearly impermeable to alcohol. It does not allow the liquid to seep through its walls and evaporate in any meaningful quantity. Red oak, by contrast, is more porous. It breathes. Alcohol stored in red oak barrels will slowly seep into the wood, will slowly evaporate through the staves. Anyone who worked regularly with industrial spirits would have known this. The shipper would have known this. The captain would have known this. Why would 17 barrels of industrial alcohol be packed in red oak? There are practical explanations, and for years those practical explanations have been offered and accepted. Red oak barrels were cheaper. There may have been a shortage of white oak containers at the time of loading. Corners were cut. These things happened in commercial shipping. The problem with these explanations is not that they are impossible. It is that they are suspiciously convenient. They close the door on questions that deserve to stay open. Because when you combine the red oak barrels with the empty barrels, something uncomfortable begins to take shape. Not all of the barrels contained what they were supposed to contain. Some of the barrels may not have been sealed in the usual way. And there is at least one documented account from a dock worker involved in the loading of the Mary Celeste. who noted at the time that something seemed unusual about a portion of the cargo, that a subset of barrels was handled differently from the rest, that they were loaded last, that they were stacked in a specific section of the hold, and that the men handling them were not the usual longshoremen, but a smaller, separate crew that arrived specifically for that portion of the job. This account was noted. It was not followed up on. The shipping company, Meissner, Ackermann and Company, was questioned during the maritime inquiry that followed the Mary Celeste's discovery. Their answers were cooperative, detailed, and almost entirely useless. They confirmed the general nature of the cargo. They confirmed the quantities as listed in the manifest. They had no explanation for the empty barrels or the red oak discrepancy. They expressed appropriate concern. They offered no additional information. And then, quietly, the questions stopped. No one pushed harder. No one demanded access to internal company records. No one asked the dock worker to elaborate. The maritime inquiry moved on to other questions, about the Dike Gracia, about the salvage claim, about what the Discovery crew had found aboard. The cargo sat in the background, officially explained, practically mysterious. There is something worth holding in your mind as we move forward through this story. In 1872, the industrial production and transportation of certain chemical substances was in a period of significant transition. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping what factories needed, what military establishments were experimenting with, and what legitimate commercial covers existed for moving materials across international borders without arousing suspicion. A commercial alcohol shipment, properly documented and insured, moving on a well-regarded vessel under the command of a trusted captain, was exactly the kind of cover that would have been invisible to casual inspection. Not every barrel on the Mary Celeste was what it claimed to be. The records, read carefully, tell you this. The question was never what was in those barrels. The question was who put them there, and what they intended to do with them when the ship arrived in Genoa. Chapter 3. Something Feels Wrong. The Mary Celeste had been at sea for approximately 2 weeks when Benjamin Briggs first noticed something wasn't right. We know this from the ship's log, specifically from the last entries that were recovered aboard the vessel when it was found. The log itself is an incomplete record, as many ships' logs of the period were. Not every day was documented with equal thoroughness, but the final legible entries combined with the physical evidence found aboard the ship allow us to reconstruct a general picture of the final days before the disappearance. By late November, the Mary Celeste had been making reasonable progress across the Atlantic. The weather had been inconsistent. Squalls, calms, the usual unpredictability of North Atlantic autumn. Nothing that an experienced crew couldn't handle. Nothing that would have alarmed a captain like Briggs. The crew was performing their duties. The ship was sound. But in the hold, something had changed. The smell was the first sign. Not the ordinary smell of a cargo hold carrying industrial spirits. That smell was expected and familiar, a sharp chemical tang that everyone aboard would have been used to from the moment the barrels were loaded. This was different. This was sharper in places it shouldn't have been, heavier in certain corners of the hold, inconsistent in a way that alcohol vapour, moving according to the predictable physics of enclosed spaces, should not have been. Several crew members reported experiencing headaches. One sailor complained of dizziness. These symptoms were attributed initially to the natural discomforts of shipboard life. Poor ventilation, the physical labour of keeping a vessel running, the effects of a sometimes rough sea on men's bodies. But Briggs, being the careful and methodical man that all accounts describe, began to pay closer attention. He inspected the hold himself. This was not standard practice for a captain. The cargo hold was the domain of the first mate, and Briggs had a trusted first mate in Albert Richardson. But something prompted him to go below personally, to walk among the barrels with a lantern, to examine them with his own eyes and nose. What he found there is not recorded explicitly in any surviving document, but the physical evidence left aboard the Mary Celeste gives us strong suggestions. Several barrels had been moved from their original positions, shifted slightly, as though they had been rolled out and then replaced. One section of the hold showed evidence of a substance on the floor that was different in colour and consistency from industrial alcohol. The cargo hatch had been opened at some point after the ship left port and before it was found drifting. The hatch cover was found nearby, not in place. The barrel count, when investigators later tallied it, did not precisely match the manifest. Something in that hold was not behaving the way alcohol was supposed to behave. Something was generating vapour, not at the rate or in the manner that any experienced sailor or cargo handler would have expected from a standard load of commercial spirits. And Briggs, who had transported cargo for his entire career, who knew what to look for and how to read the signs, understood that something was wrong before he could articulate exactly what it was. He would have been thinking through possibilities. A leak. Possible. But the barrel showed no obvious damage. A reaction between the cargo and the wood. Possible with poorly treated red oak barrels, which he may or may not have known were part of this shipment. Something else. Something he had no framework for, because nothing in his career had prepared him for cargo that was not what it was supposed to be. His wife Sarah's final letter home, written during the voyage and never sent, was found aboard the ship when it was discovered. In it she describes the journey as pleasant overall, mentions the weather, talks about their daughter Sophia's adjustment to life aboard. She says nothing alarming, but the letter was written in the earlier days of the voyage, before the hold inspection, before whatever Briggs found changed the atmosphere aboard the ship. After a certain point, the log entries become shorter, more clipped. The careful, professional notations of a man doing his job become something slightly different. The notations of a man who is watchful, who is waiting, who is paying attention to something that doesn't belong in his frame of reference. The last recorded position in the Mary Celeste's log was approximately 600 miles west of the Portuguese coastline. It was the morning of November 25th, 1872. After that, there is nothing. Chapter 4. The event. Alcohol vapour is invisible. This is important to understand because the image most people carry when they think of an explosion is one of fire, of something visible happening, of light and heat and destruction that you can see and measure. But vapour explosions are different. Certain chemical vapours, when they accumulate in an enclosed space in sufficient concentration and are then disturbed by a sudden pressure change, by a structural shift, by any number of triggers, can produce an explosive decompression that does not require ignition. No fire, no flames, no visible damage necessarily to the surrounding structure. Just a concussive force, a pressure wave, a sudden violent redistribution of air and matter in a confined space that hits the human body like a wall. This is the leading scientific explanation, endorsed by a number of maritime historians and chemical experts who have examined the Mary Celeste case, for what may have triggered the abandonment of the ship. The red oak barrels, being more porous than standard white oak, would have allowed the alcohol to slowly seep into the wood and evaporate into the hold's enclosed air. Over days and weeks, the concentration of alcohol vapour in the lower decks could have built to dangerous levels without any obvious visible sign, no fire, no discoloration, no damage that would have been immediately apparent from above. Then something, the opening of a hatch, a shift in atmospheric pressure as a storm system moved through, the movement of barrels against each other in heavy seas, triggered the release. Not an explosion in the dramatic cinematic sense, but a violent and terrifying pressure event, a concussive burst that would have shaken the ship to its bones, rattled every fitting and joint, felt from below deck like the beginning of something catastrophic. Briggs had been monitoring the hold. He knew something was wrong. He had perhaps already ordered the cargo hatches left open to allow the vapours to dissipate. The hatch cover found beside the opening when the ship was discovered suggests this. He may have been in the middle of exactly this process, trying to air out the hold, trying to bring the vapour concentration down before it reached a dangerous level, when the event occurred. The pump rod was found disassembled. This is a detail that has puzzled investigators for generations, and the standard interpretation is that the crew had been checking the pump as part of routine maintenance. But there is another interpretation, that someone had been checking the pump because they were concerned about whether the hold was taking on anything, because they were already worried about conditions below deck and were trying to assess the situation. The sounding rod, used to measure the level of water in the bilge, was found lying on the deck. It had been used recently. Again, routine maintenance is the standard explanation, but routine maintenance does not usually result in the sounding rod being left out on deck rather than returned to its storage place. Someone was checking the ship's condition, and whatever they found, or whatever happened next, prevented them from completing the ordinary act of putting the tool away. And then, the event. A sudden, violent percussion from below, the kind of force that, if you were standing on deck, would feel like the ship had struck something solid. The kind of force that, if you were below, near the cargo, would leave no doubt in your mind that something catastrophic had just occurred, or was about to. No fire, no damage visible from the outside, but the people on board would not have known that. They would have known what they felt, they would have known what they heard, they would have known that something in that hold had just produced a force powerful enough to shake the ship. And Briggs, the careful practical man, would have made a decision. Chapter 5. The Decision. Benjamin Briggs was not an impulsive man. Everything we know about him, every account from the sailors who knew him, from the merchants who hired him, from the family members who described his character, points consistently toward a man who thought before he acted, who assessed before he committed, who did not panic in difficult situations, but instead worked the problem methodically, the way a skilled craftsman works through a complicated repair step by step with steady hands. So when the pressure event occurred, when the concussive force shook the Mary Celeste and told him, in the most visceral possible language, that the cargo hold was in a dangerous state, he would not have given in to immediate chaos. He would have thought. His options were limited. He was mid-Atlantic, weeks from any port, with a crew of 7, a wife and a 2-year-old daughter, aboard a ship that might or might not be on the verge of a catastrophic explosion. The cargo hold contained either alcohol vapour at dangerous concentrations, or something worse that he could not fully identify. He could not safely go below to investigate further. He could not know from the deck whether the structural integrity of the hull had been compromised. What he could do was remove his people from the immediate danger. The decision to take to the lifeboat was not, in this reading of events, a decision of despair. It was a decision of caution, a temporary measure. An experienced captain, confronted with what appeared to be an imminent explosion risk, ordering a controlled evacuation to a safe distance, while the situation either resolved itself or became clear. He would have been thinking, we move away from the ship, far enough that if the worst happens, we survive it. We watch. If nothing happens, if the vapour dissipates, if the pressure stabilises, if the ship remains intact, we return. We retrieve what we need. We continue the voyage. The lifeboat carried aboard the Mary Celeste at the time of departure was a yawl, a small auxiliary boat capable of carrying multiple people. When the ship was found, this yawl was gone. But here is the detail that is often underappreciated in this part of the story. A length of rope was found trailing from the stern of the Mary Celeste. One end was secured to the ship, the other end, frayed, the fibres separated as though under extreme tension, was not secured to anything. This is the rope that once connected the lifeboat to the ship. It had been cut, or it had snapped. This distinction matters enormously. A rope that is cut speaks to deliberate action, to a decision being made. A rope that snaps speaks to forces beyond control, to wind and wave and the physics of two objects being pulled in different directions. The condition of the rope as found suggests the latter. The fibres were not cleanly severed but separated under stress, consistent with a sudden increase in tension that the rope could not bear. If Briggs lowered the lifeboat and tethered it to the Mary Celeste, intending for the ship to pull the boat along at a safe distance while he monitored the situation from afar, and if the wind then shifted and the Mary Celeste began to move faster than anticipated, and the tether pulled taut and then snapped, then in a matter of minutes the ship would have been moving away under sail while the people in the lifeboat watched helplessly from an open sea. In the right weather conditions, and the weather records for that stretch of the Atlantic in late November 1872 indicate a period of significant wind, the Mary Celeste could have put considerable distance between herself and the lifeboat in a remarkably short time. The crew would have rowed, they would have tried. But a fully rigged brigantine running before a decent wind is not something 10 people in an open boat can catch by rowing. And the fog, because there was fog in those waters at that time, documented fog, the kind of thick Atlantic fog that swallows ships from view in minutes, would have closed around the Mary Celeste very quickly. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, and the people in the lifeboat were alone on the open Atlantic in November, without their ship, with whatever limited supplies they had brought in the assumption that they would be returning within hours. Chapter 6. The Separation. Imagine what it felt like to watch that ship disappear. You have been at sea your whole career. You know the ocean, you know ships, you know the mathematics of it. You understand, on some deep and wordless level, what it means when a vessel under full sail runs before a strong wind in open water. You know how fast it moves. You know that the gap between you and it is not closing. You row anyway. For a few minutes, maybe longer, you row. The men pull at the oars with everything they have because there is a captain giving instructions, and because the ship is still visible, and because the human mind is reluctant to accept until it must the absolute nature of what is happening. You can see the Mary Celeste. She is right there. She is your ship. She has your belongings, your navigation instruments, your food, your water. She has everything, and then the fog comes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way the North Atlantic fog moves in that season, gradually then completely. It fills in the space between you and the ship, and the Mary Celeste becomes a shape, then a shadow, then nothing, just grey, just the sound of water against the hull of a small open boat, just the sound of breathing and the creak of oars and the vast featureless silence of open ocean. 10 people. November. The North Atlantic. No ship. The temperature in those waters at that time of year sits between roughly 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. An open wooden lifeboat offers no protection from wind. The sea, even without being violent, is relentless in its motion. A constant, cold, exhausting motion that the human body absorbs without respite. A healthy adult in those conditions, without shelter, without adequate clothing for prolonged exposure, without the ability to generate significant body heat through activity, would be in serious trouble within hours. Briggs would have known this. He would have taken stock of what they had. Whatever food and water had been brought into the lifeboat, and given that the evacuation was supposed to be temporary, it may not have been much. He would have rationed it. He would have tried to establish a course. He would have attempted to navigate toward the nearest shipping lane, toward the nearest coast, toward any possibility of rescue. But here is the brutal mathematics of the situation. They were approximately 600 miles west of the Azores, in a small open boat, in late November, with a wind and sea state that was, by the maritime records of that period, building toward rough conditions. No lifeboat was ever found, not a plank of it, not a piece of clothing, not a single item that could be identified as coming from the Mary Celeste. This tells you something. It tells you that whatever happened to those 10 people, it was complete. The ocean kept its secret entirely. There was no wreckage to find, because the sea had absorbed all of it, had taken the lifeboat and the people in it, and everything they carried, and left no evidence behind. The Mary Celeste drifted on. Under full sail, on a favourable wind, she moved east across the Atlantic, on a course that, by a strange geometry of wind and current, would carry her across approximately 800 miles of open ocean, without hitting anything, without being spotted by any other vessel, without coming to grief on any reef or shoal, until the crew of the Dei Gracia finally caught sight of her. She was a ghost ship in the truest sense, not haunted by supernatural forces, haunted by absence, haunted by what used to be there and wasn't anymore. Chapter 7. The Silent Ship. When the crew of the Dei Gratia first spotted the Mary Celeste through a spyglass on the afternoon of December the 5th, 1872, she looked like a ship having a bad day. She was yawing, moving through the water in an irregular side-to-side manner that indicated she was not under proper control. Her sails were set, but not all of them were drawing correctly. Some were badly furled, some were set improperly, in a way that suggested they had been rigged by capable hands, and then left to manage themselves through whatever weather had come after. She was moving, but she was moving like a ship that had forgotten it had a destination. Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Gratia knew Benjamin Briggs personally. They had dined together just days before the Mary Celeste departed New York. When Morehouse realised through the glass that the ship he was watching was the Mary Celeste, he was, by all accounts, immediately concerned. He sent a boarding party. The men who went aboard found a ship that was, in almost every material sense, intact. The cargo was there. The food was there. The navigation instruments were there. A sextant, a chronometer, charts, all the equipment a competent navigator needs to determine position and plot a course. The personal belongings of the crew were there. The personal belongings of the captain's family were there. Sarah Briggs's melodeon, her small keyboard instrument, just sat in the cabin, sheet music still on the stand. Sophia's toys were in the cabin. Briggs's navigational notes and books were on the chart table. Nothing had been ransacked. Nothing had been taken in the manner of pirates or thieves. The ship had not been the victim of violence. There were no bloodstains, no signs of struggle, no broken fittings or damaged equipment consistent with a fight. The only things missing were the people and the lifeboat. The binnacle, the housing for the compass, had been knocked over, and the compass itself was damaged. This has been interpreted in various ways, as evidence of a sudden violent event that destabilised things aboard, as evidence of rushed handling during the evacuation, as evidence of weather damage. But the binnacle damage is consistent with the kind of structural shock that a significant vapour explosion would produce, a sharp concussive force transmitted through the hull and deck. The galley stove held food in various stages of preparation. This has been one of the most discussed details of the discovery, because partially prepared food suggests a sudden interruption of the ordinary routine of life. People were eating, or preparing to eat, and then something happened, and they stopped. The food sat there. It sat there for almost 2 weeks while the ship drifted across the Atlantic, and it was still there when the boarding party found it. But here is a detail that is frequently glossed over. The food found in the galley was not in a state consistent with having been freshly prepared on the day of discovery. It was in a state consistent with having been there for a significant period of time, which means the interruption to the galley routine did not happen on December 5th. It happened weeks earlier. It happened close to when the log entries ended, close to when the last known position was recorded, close to when, in our reconstruction, the pressure event in the hold triggered the evacuation. The ship had been drifting, empty and silent, for roughly 10 days. The boarding party found the cargo hatch open. They found the sounding rod on the deck. They found the frayed rope trailing from the stern. They found the water in the bilge at a level that, given the conditions, was not alarming. They found everything that a careful, methodical captain would have left behind in an emergency evacuation that was meant to be temporary. They did not find what they were looking for. No note, no signal, no explanation, no reason. Just a ship, sailing itself across the Atlantic, waiting for its people to come back. Chapter 8. The Discovery Crew. The crew of the Dei Gratia spent the next 11 days sailing the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar. 3 men were split off from the Dei Gratia to sail the recovered vessel, a difficult and dangerous task given that the ship was short-crewed and that the weather between the Discovery Point and Gibraltar was not cooperative. They managed it. Both ships arrived in Gibraltar in mid-December 1872. What happened next is where this story becomes something other than a straightforward mystery. The Maritime Court in Gibraltar, under the authority of the British Admiralty, immediately impounded both ships and began an inquiry. This was standard procedure. A ship found adrift at sea with its crew missing and its cargo intact represented both a legal question, who owns the cargo, who is entitled to the salvage reward, and a practical one, what happened? The salvage hearing is where the official record of the Mary Celeste case begins to develop its strange texture. Salvage law in the 1870s was well established. A crew that recovered a drifting vessel at sea was entitled to a portion of its value as a reward for the service. This was the incentive that made rescuing drifting ships economically viable, and it was a legitimate and expected part of maritime commerce. But the Gibraltar court, rather than treating the Dei Gratia crew as straightforward benefactors who had done the difficult and dangerous work of bringing a drifting ship to port, treated them with suspicion. The presiding official, Frederick Solly Flood, was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, and a man who, by the historical accounts of the inquiry, seems to have arrived at the proceedings with a theory he was determined to prove. His theory was that the crew of the Desigratia had somehow been involved in what happened to the Mary Celeste, that this was not an innocent rescue but something darker, that Morehouse and his crew had colluded with Briggs and the Mary Celeste crew in some kind of insurance fraud or worse. To support this theory, Solly Flood commissioned physical examinations of the ship that were extensive, thorough, and, in the end, found almost nothing. The sword that an early inspector thought might have bloodstains on it turned out, upon chemical analysis, to have no blood. There were no marks of violence. There was no evidence of the elaborate conspiracy that Solly Flood seemed to believe he was on the verge of uncovering. But in the process of pursuing his theory, Solly Flood conducted a very thorough examination of the ship, an examination that included the cargo hold. What the inquiry records reveal about that examination is interesting not for what they say, but for what they don't say. The examination of the cargo is described in general terms. The barrels are noted. The empty barrels are mentioned but not elaborated upon. The red oak barrels are not discussed. The section of the hold where the irregular barrels had been loaded, the specific area that the dock worker had noted during loading, is not described in detail in the surviving records. The salvage payout to the Dei Gratia crew was set at £1,700. The total value of ship and cargo was assessed at well over £45,000. The standard salvage award in this period was roughly a third to a half of the recovered value. The Dei Gratia crew received roughly 3.5%. Solly Flood and the court explained this low award as a reflection of their suspicion that the Dei Gratia crew was somehow implicated in the disappearance. But they never charged anyone with anything. They never produced evidence sufficient to bring a criminal case. They simply reduced the reward, expressed their suspicion formally in court documents, and closed the inquiry without a conclusion. The cargo was eventually delivered to Genoa. Whether all of it arrived, and whether all of it was accounted for upon arrival, is not in the publicly available record. Frederick Solly Flood died in 1888, having never publicly revised his theory or admitted that the Dei Gratia crew was innocent. He seems to have genuinely believed to the end that something criminal had happened aboard the Mary Celeste. He was likely not wrong about that. He was simply looking for the crime in the wrong place. Chapter 9. The Court that asked too many questions. Maritime courts in the 1870s operated by rules that were both precise and flexible. Precise in their application of salvage law and established procedure, flexible in the latitude given to presiding officials to interpret evidence and direct inquiries. This flexibility could produce justice. It could also produce something else. The Gibraltar inquiry into the Mary Celeste produced something else. The contradictions in the official record begin almost immediately. The first inspection of the cargo, conducted by the court's appointed surveyor, produced a report that described the barrels in general terms and noted the empty ones without particular alarm. The second inspection, conducted days later, produced a report that differed from the first in several small but significant ways. Barrel counts that varied by small margins, descriptions of the hold's condition that were worded differently, observations that were present in one report and absent in the other. These discrepancies were noted at the time. They were not resolved. The testimony of the Dei Gratia crew members was taken individually and at length. Their accounts of what they found aboard the Mary Celeste were consistent with each other on the major points: the empty decks, the abandoned personal belongings, the intact cargo, the frayed rope trailing from the stern. But their accounts of the cargo hold, of what they saw when they went below, were notably brief. They had inspected the hold. They could confirm that cargo was present. Beyond that, their testimony about the contents of the hold was vague in ways that their testimony about other aspects of the discovery was not. This vagueness might be innocent. Sailors who were focused on the practical task of assessing whether the ship was seaworthy might not have paid close attention to the specifics of what was in the barrels, But it might not be innocent. It might be the vagueness of men who had seen something, had understood what it meant, had discussed it privately, and had decided not to discuss it publicly. The shipping company's records were requested and eventually produced. What was produced was not what was requested. What was produced was a subset of the relevant documents: the official manifest, the insurance records, the general correspondence between the company and the shipping agent, the internal records that would have shown the full history of the cargo loading, who authorised what, which crew handled which barrels, whether any non-standard materials were included in the shipment, were described as either unavailable or irrelevant. No one pushed back on this characterization. The inquiry concluded without a finding. Not a finding of accident, not a finding of crime, not a finding of foul play, simply a failure to determine what had happened. This was unusual. Maritime courts of the period generally arrived at some official conclusion, even if that conclusion was merely an acknowledgement that the evidence was insufficient. The Gibraltar inquiry did not even do that. It simply stopped. The file was closed. The case was marked as unresolved. The surviving documentary record of the Gibraltar inquiry is not complete. Portions of the official transcript are missing from the archives. Whether they were lost through ordinary institutional attrition, the normal fate of 19th century paperwork, or through something more deliberate, is impossible to say with certainty. But the gaps in the record fall, with notable consistency, around the cargo-related testimony. The parts of the inquiry that dealt directly with the contents of the hold, with the specific nature of the barrels, with what the Discovery crew saw when they went below, these are precisely the parts of the record that have gaps. Perhaps this is coincidence. Documents are lost all the time for all kinds of mundane reasons. But in a case where the central mystery remains unsolved a century and a half later, the pattern of what survives and what doesn't is worth noticing. Whoever loaded something onto the Mary Celeste that shouldn't have been there was careful. They were careful at the loading stage, using legitimate commercial cover and keeping the unusual portion of the shipment small relative to the whole. They were careful at the inquiry stage, where the questions that might have led somewhere instead led nowhere. They were careful in a way that suggests institutional competence, not the carelessness of opportunistic criminals, but the practiced methodology of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before. The Mary Celeste was not an anomaly. She was very possibly a routine operation that went wrong in a way that nobody planned for and nobody could have anticipated. The vapour event, the tether snapping, the people in the lifeboat watching their ship disappear into the fog. The routine part worked perfectly. The part that went wrong was the part that nobody can ever plan for on the open ocean, which is the ocean itself. Chapter 10. The Hidden Cargo Theory. We have been building toward this, toward the question that the official record carefully avoided asking, that the maritime inquiry conspicuously failed to pursue, that the shipping company's records were carefully pruned to leave unanswerable. What was in those barrels? Not the white oak barrels, not the routine denatured alcohol that made up the bulk of the cargo, the red oak barrels, the ones that breathe, the ones that were loaded last separately by a different crew, the ones that when the ship was found turned out to be empty, not leaking, not damaged, simply empty, as though whatever they had contained had already done what it was supposed to do. The 1870s were a period of significant experimentation in industrial chemistry. The gap between civilian manufacturing chemistry and military experimental chemistry was, in that era, narrow in ways that it would later widen. Many of the most significant industrial chemicals of the period had both legitimate commercial applications and potential military or quasi-military ones, and the networks that moved these chemicals around the world operated under commercial cover, because commercial cover was the only cover that worked at scale. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which controlled significant portions of Italy and the Adriatic at this period, was engaged in a series of military modernization programs that required, among other things, the steady importation of chemical precursors and industrial materials from the more industrially developed Atlantic economies. The Italian port of Genoa was one of the primary entry points for these materials, a busy commercial port with the kind of volume and activity that made careful inspection of individual cargoes practically impossible. A shipment of industrial alcohol, moved on a reliable American vessel under the command of a trusted captain, bound for Genoa, would have attracted no particular scrutiny. It would have been one of dozens of similar shipments moving through those shipping lanes in any given season. It would have been properly insured, properly documented, properly manifested. The only people who needed to know what was actually in those red oak barrels were the people who put them there and the people who were supposed to receive them. Neither group presumably planned for the vapour event. Neither group planned for the tether to snap. Neither group planned for the lifeboat to disappear in the North Atlantic fog with 10 people inside it. The specific nature of what those barrels contained is something we cannot know with certainty from the surviving evidence. But we can reason about it from the available facts. The substance, whatever it was, produced vapour in an enclosed space, vapour at a concentration and character that alarmed experienced sailors and eventually triggered a pressure event significant enough to prompt a full evacuation of a ship that was otherwise in sound condition. It was stable enough to have been loaded and transported without incident under normal conditions, but unstable enough to become dangerous when the red oak barrels began to allow it to seep and evaporate over the course of the weeks at sea. It was stored in porous containers rather than sealed ones, which could indicate that whoever prepared it understood that sealed containers would be more likely to rupture under pressure, and that the slow-release properties of red oak were deliberately chosen as a safer transport method. These characteristics are consistent with a class of experimental industrial chemicals that were being developed and tested in the 1860s and 1870s for potential use in military or industrial applications. The specific chemicals involved in early explosive or propellant research of this period produced exactly these kinds of effects under exactly these kinds of conditions. Vapour build-up in enclosed spaces, pressure events without visible fire, the kind of concussive blast that leaves the structure around it largely intact while creating the overwhelming impression of imminent catastrophe. This is not a theory built from imagination. It is built from the physical evidence left aboard the Mary Celeste, from the gaps in the official record, from the behaviour of the shipping company during the inquiry, from the anomalies in the cargo manifest, and from what we know about the chemical and industrial commerce of the period. The hidden cargo theory does not require anyone to be a monster. Briggs was not a knowing participant. Every indication is that he was as surprised and alarmed by the conditions in his hold as anyone. He was a captain hired to transport a legitimate shipment and was, without his knowledge, used as a vehicle for moving something else. The Dei Gratia crew may have recognised something for what it was, and made the practical decision, in a maritime court already treating them with suspicion, to keep what they knew to themselves. The shipping company and whoever they were working for had done everything right. They had covered their tracks thoroughly enough that even a determined official inquiry couldn't find the thread. The only thing that went wrong was the ocean. The North Atlantic in November, which has been defeating human plans since before there were ships capable of crossing it, simply did what it does. The vapour seeped through the red oak, the pressure built, the tether snapped, the fog came in, and 10 people were left on the open ocean with no ship and no way home. Chapter 11. The Truth That Disappeared. There is a kind of disappearance that is more complete than death. Death, at least, leaves something behind. A body, a grave, a record, something that can be pointed to, that can be named, that can be held in the human mind as a marker of what was lost. There is grief in death, but there is also anchor, something to return to, something to orient around. The Mary Celeste left no such anchor, no lifeboat, no wreckage, no bodies, no note, no final entry in the log, no bottle message. The 10 people who were on that ship, Benjamin and Sarah Briggs, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, Albert Richardson, Andrew Gilling, Edward Head, Volkert Lorenzen, Bos Lorenzen, Arian Martins, Gottlieb Gonderschalk, disappeared into the North Atlantic in November 1872 as completely as if they had never existed. Their families waited. This is the part of the story that, is hardest to sit with. Not the mystery, not the hidden cargo, not the conspiracy of silence in the Gibraltar inquiry, but the families on land who didn't know, who received the news of the Mary Celeste's discovery as a ship, not as an explanation, who spent the rest of their lives in the particular purgatory of not knowing. Captain Briggs's elderly mother received word of the discovery in the same fragmentary, alarming way that bad news travelled in the 1870s, through newspapers, through port authorities, through the slow and painful communication networks of the pre-telegraph era. She had received her son's last letter, written in New York before departure, describing pleasant weather and a sound vessel. Then nothing. Then news of a ghost ship. Then silence where an explanation should have been. His son Arthur, left at home with his grandmother in Massachusetts, was old enough to understand that his father was gone, but young enough that the absence would shape the rest of his life in ways that only become clear in retrospect. He grew up with an unanswered question at the centre of his family's history. The crew's families, many of them in Germany, in the communities from which the German sailors had come, never received any communication that adequately explained what had happened to their fathers, brothers, sons. The maritime court issued no conclusion. The shipping company sent formal condolences. The ocean offered nothing. The Mary Celeste herself continued to sail for another 13 years. She passed through multiple owners, survived several more incidents, and developed a reputation, partly legendary, partly practical, as an unlucky ship. Sailors were reluctant to serve on her. Insurers were reluctant to cover her. Eventually, in 1885, she was deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti in an insurance fraud scheme orchestrated by her final owner. This effort too was unsuccessful, and the owner was caught, and the fraud was prosecuted. The Mary Celeste's final chapter was as tangled and dishonest as everything that had happened to her since 1872. She was left on the reef where she had been run aground. She slowly broke apart and disappeared into the Caribbean seafloor. In 2001, an underwater archaeology team located what they believed to be her remains, a collection of wooden planks and metal fittings on a reef off the coast of Haiti, in shallow water, consistent with the location and circumstances of the 1885 wrecking. The wood, tested and analysed, matched the construction characteristics of the Mary Celeste. She had finally stopped moving. The cargo discrepancies were never investigated. No authority ever publicly acknowledged that the manifest might have been falsified, or that non-standard materials might have been included in the shipment. The shipping company, Meissner, Ackerman and Company, continued operations after the incident without any public consequences. No one was ever charged with anything in connection with the disappearance of the Mary Celeste's crew. The official version of events, that the cause of the abandonment is unknown, that the crew's fate is a mystery, that the Mary Celeste represents one of the great unexplained incidents of maritime history, has remained the official version for 153 years. It is taught in schools, it appears in encyclopedias, it is the answer that is given when someone asks what happened. But the real story is in the gaps, in the red oak barrels, in the empty containers that held something and then didn't, in the dock worker's observation that was never followed up, in the portion of the Gibraltar inquiry transcript that didn't survive, in the salvage award that was a fraction of what it should have been, handed down by a court that knew something was wrong but couldn't, or wouldn't, say what. The truth about the Mary Celeste didn't disappear because it was mysterious. It disappeared because someone worked very hard to make it disappear, and the 10 people who might have been able to explain everything, who had been below decks, who had smelled what shouldn't have been there, who had felt the concussive force of a vapour event in the hold of a ship carrying cargo that wasn't what it claimed to be. Those 10 people were already gone, already on the open ocean in a small lifeboat, already at the mercy of a November storm in the North Atlantic, already beyond the reach of any inquiry, any court, any question. The Mary Celeste wasn't abandoned because of mystery. She was abandoned because something on board wasn't meant to be discovered, and the only people who knew what it was never made it back. Sleep now. The ocean keeps its secrets. It always has. Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, where winter silence stretches for miles and the nearest town feels like another world entirely, there stands a forest of antennas. 180 metallic towers rising from the frozen earth, each one aimed at the sky. They hum with power when activated, sending invisible beams of concentrated energy upward into the ionosphere itself. The official story calls it science, research into atmospheric behaviour and radio wave propagation. But what if those antennas were doing something else? What if the facility wasn't just listening to the sky, but learning how to control it? What if weather patterns, earthquakes, even human consciousness itself could be manipulated by the right frequency broadcast from the right location? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most persistent and unsettling conspiracy theories of the modern era, the story of HAARP and the possibility that the sky above us is no longer entirely natural. Before we begin, if you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review truly helps the channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unknown. Also, if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening, and if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribing really makes a difference. Also, a huge thank you to Mike for suggesting this topic. This one's for you. Now, let's head north. To the cold, to the isolation, and to the antennas that some believe touch something they were never meant to reach. Chapter 1. The Facility in the Wilderness. Gakona, Alaska sits roughly 200 miles northeast of Anchorage. It's a tiny community, population barely over 200 people. The landscape is harsh. Long winters, short summers, endless stretches of forest and tundra. It's the kind of place where you go if you want to disappear, or if you're building something you don't want the world to see. In the early 1990s, construction began on a research facility, unlike anything most people had ever encountered. It wasn't a weapons testing range. It wasn't a missile silo. It was a field of antennas. Rows and rows of them, stretching across 33 acres of cleared land. Each antenna stood 72 feet tall. Together they formed what would become the most powerful ionospheric heater ever constructed. The project was called the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP. It was a joint effort, funded and operated by the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The official mission was straightforward. Study the ionosphere, the upper layer of Earth's atmosphere where charged particles interact with solar radiation. Understand how radio waves behave in that region. Improve communication systems for military and civilian purposes. Enhance radar technology. All legitimate scientific goals. But the scale of the facility raised questions almost immediately. If this was just research, why did it require such immense power? Why build it in one of the most remote locations in the country? And why involve multiple branches of the military in what was supposedly a benign atmospheric study? From the very beginning, HAARP was shrouded in secrecy. Not the kind of secrecy that comes from classified stamps and blacked out documents, but the quieter kind. The kind that comes from isolation, from limited public access, from vague descriptions of purpose. And in that silence, speculation began to grow. The facility's remote location made it nearly impossible for casual observers to monitor its activities. No residential neighbourhoods nearby, no schools or hospitals that might raise concerns about electromagnetic radiation exposure. Just wilderness, military jurisdiction, and a perimeter that kept civilians at a comfortable distance. Construction crews who worked on the project were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Standard practice for military contractors, but it added another layer of mystery. What exactly were they building out there? And why did it need to be so far from civilization? The antennas themselves were unlike typical radio towers. They weren't designed to broadcast commercial signals or relay communications. They were built to concentrate enormous amounts of electromagnetic energy into focused beams that would be fired directly into the upper atmosphere. The engineering required for such a system was extraordinary. Each antenna had to be precisely calibrated, synchronized with the others, capable of handling extreme power loads without overheating or failing. When the facility was completed in the late 1990s, it represented a technological achievement that few outside the scientific community fully understood. To most people, it was just a field of metal towers in Alaska, but to those who began investigating its purpose, it was something else entirely. A tool that could, theoretically, reach up and touch the edge of space itself, and perhaps pull something back down. Local residents noticed changes almost immediately. The facility would activate periodically, sometimes for hours at a time. During these periods, strange things happened. Electrical equipment would malfunction. Radio signals would become garbled or disappear entirely. The sky itself seemed different, charged with an energy that felt unnatural. Some dismissed these observations as coincidence or misunderstanding. Others began to wonder if the facility was doing exactly what conspiracy theorists would later claim, experimenting with forces that humanity had no business manipulating. Chapter 2. The Man Behind the Patents. To understand the conspiracy theories surrounding HAARP, you have to go back further. Back to a physicist named Bernard Eastlund. Eastlund was a scientist working in the field of plasma physics and ionospheric research during the height of the Cold War. He was brilliant, unconventional, and deeply interested in the practical applications of theoretical physics. While others focused on academic papers and laboratory experiments, Eastlund was thinking about what could be built, what could be done with enough energy, enough precision, enough understanding of how the atmosphere worked. In the 1980s, he filed a series of patents that would later become the foundation for much of the speculation around HAARP. The most notable was patent number 4,686,605, titled Method and Apparatus for Altering a Region in the Earth's Atmosphere, Ionosphere and Magnetosphere. The language in the patent was striking. It didn't just describe studying the ionosphere, it described altering it, heating specific regions of the upper atmosphere with focused radio frequency energy, creating concentrated zones of charged particles that could be manipulated, moved, or directed at will. The patent outlined potential applications that read like something from a science fiction novel, disrupting enemy communications by creating artificial disturbances in the ionosphere that would scatter or absorb radio signals, enhancing friendly radar and surveillance systems by modifying atmospheric conditions to improve signal propagation, modifying weather patterns by influencing atmospheric energy distribution, potentially steering storms or dispersing hurricanes before they made landfall. But the most alarming section dealt with the possibility of triggering seismic activity. Eastlund's patent suggested that by directing enough energy into specific regions of the ionosphere, and by carefully modulating that energy, it might be possible to influence tectonic processes deep beneath the Earth's surface. The mechanism was complex, involving the interaction between ionospheric heating and the magnetosphere, which in turn could affect geomagnetic currents flowing through the planet's crust. These currents, the patent suggested, might be capable of adding stress to already strained fault lines, potentially triggering earthquakes in geologically vulnerable areas. Eastlund himself claimed his work was theoretical, speculative, a thought experiment about what might be possible if enough energy could be focused in the right way. He insisted his patents were never intended to describe an actual weapon, but rather to explore the outer boundaries of what ionospheric research might achieve. But the details were too precise, too specific. They read less like academic musings and more like blueprints. The patent included technical specifications, power calculations, antenna configurations, and frequency ranges. It described exactly how such a system might be built, how it would operate, and what effects it could produce. When HAARP was announced in the early 1990s, conspiracy researchers immediately drew the connection. The facility's design matched Eastlund's concepts almost exactly. High-powered transmitters arranged in a phased array configuration, antennas capable of focusing energy into narrow beams that could be steered electronically toward any point in the sky. Ionospheric heating as the core mechanism, with power levels that exceeded anything previously attempted in atmospheric research. It was as if someone had taken his patents off the shelf, classified them, and decided to build them in the most remote location they could find. Eastland himself would later distance himself from HAARP, at least publicly. He gave interviews where he claimed the facility was using his ideas, but had gone beyond what he originally envisioned. Whether that meant HAARP was less ambitious than his patents suggested, or far more dangerous, he never fully clarified. His statements were always carefully worded, leaving room for interpretation. Some believed he was walking back his earlier work because he realised the implications of what he had designed. Others thought he was under pressure from government agencies to downplay the connection between his patents and the actual facility. A few conspiracy theorists suggested he'd been threatened, forced to publicly deny involvement while privately continuing to consult on classified projects. Eastland passed away in 2007, taking whatever deeper knowledge he had with him, but the patents remain, public record, available for anyone to read, and they describe capabilities that sound less like science and more like the tools of gods, or perhaps something worse, the ability to reach into the atmosphere and reshape it according to human will, the power to turn weather itself into a weapon, the means to shake the Earth's foundations from hundreds of miles away. Whether HAARP was ever intended to fulfill these purposes remains a matter of intense debate, but the fact that someone thought they were possible, designed systems to achieve them, and then saw a facility built that matched those designs almost perfectly, is undeniable. Chapter 3. The Array itself. When HAARP became fully operational in the late 1990s, it consisted of 180 antennas arranged in a rectangular grid covering 33 acres of Alaskan wilderness. Each antenna was a towering steel structure, 72 feet tall, capable of transmitting radio waves at frequencies between 2.8 and 10 megahertz. Together, they could generate a combined effective radiated power of 3.6 billion watts. To put that in perspective, most commercial radio stations operate at power levels measured in thousands or tens of thousands of watts. HAARP's output dwarfed them by orders of magnitude. It was, by far, the most powerful radio frequency transmitter ever built for ionospheric research. Nothing else in the civilian or even most military installations came close to matching its raw power output. The antennas worked in coordination, forming what's called a phased array. By carefully timing the transmission from each individual antenna, the array could focus its energy into a concentrated beam. That beam could be steered electronically, aimed at specific regions of the ionosphere without physically moving the antennas themselves. The precision was remarkable. Operators could target a section of sky no larger than a few kilometers across, located hundreds of miles overhead, and heat it to temperatures significantly higher than the surrounding atmosphere. When activated, the array would send pulses of energy upward. Those pulses would travel through the lower atmosphere, largely unaffected by clouds, moisture, or air density. They would pass through the stratosphere without significant interaction. But when they reached the ionosphere, roughly 50 to 300 miles above the Earth's surface, something remarkable happened. The energy would interact with charged particles, primarily electrons and ions floating in the thin upper atmosphere. These particles would absorb the radio frequency energy and convert it into heat and motion. Temperatures in the targeted region could increase by several hundred degrees. The electron density would change, creating disturbances that could be measured by instruments on the ground and in space. Scientists called this ionospheric heating. The process was observable, measurable, and theoretically well understood. During active experiments, researchers could detect changes in electron density, temperature, and electromagnetic behavior in the targeted region. They could study how these changes affected radio wave propagation, how long the heated region took to cool back down, and how the disturbance spread through the surrounding ionosphere. Occasionally, the heating would create artificial auroras, visible glows in the night sky, similar to the northern lights but localized and controlled. These auroras appeared as patches of green, red, or purple light that would shimmer and pulse in rhythm with HAARP's transmission patterns. They were beautiful, eerie, and unlike anything most people had ever seen. For researchers, this was invaluable. It allowed them to study how the ionosphere responded to energy inputs under controlled conditions. They could test theories about plasma physics, investigate how solar storms might affect satellite communications, and develop better models for predicting how radio signals would behave during different atmospheric conditions. All useful data for improving satellite communications, GPS accuracy, and over-the-horizon radar systems. But for conspiracy theorists, the implications were far darker. If HAARP could heat a section of the ionosphere, could it push that heated air downward? The ionosphere, despite being incredibly thin, still interacts with the denser atmosphere below through various mechanisms. Heated regions create pressure differences. Pressure differences drive wind. Wind affects weather patterns. Could HAARP create artificial high-pressure zones that would redirect jet streams? Could it intensify storms by adding energy to already unstable atmospheric systems? Could it trigger droughts by persistently heating regions above agricultural areas, disrupting normal precipitation patterns? The physics of such scenarios were debatable. Mainstream atmospheric scientists argued that HAARP's energy output, while impressive for a human-built device, was utterly insignificant compared to the natural forces that drive weather. The sun pumps trillions upon trillions of watts into Earth's atmosphere every second. HAARP's few billion watts, applied to a tiny section of the upper atmosphere for a few minutes at a time, would be like trying to change the course of a hurricane by throwing ice cubes at it. But conspiracy theorists pointed to chaos theory, the butterfly effect, the idea that small changes in a complex system can cascade into large effects through feedback loops and amplification. What if HAARP wasn't trying to overpower natural weather systems, but rather to nudge them at critical moments? A small push applied at exactly the right time and place could, theoretically, have disproportionate effects. And if the energy could influence particles in the sky, what might it do to the electrical systems in the human brain? The brain operates on electrical impulses. Neurons fire through electrochemical signals that propagate at specific frequencies. If external electromagnetic fields could interfere with those frequencies, could they alter thoughts, emotions, or perceptions? This was where the conspiracy theories became truly unsettling. Because unlike weather manipulation, which would require enormous sustained power outputs, influencing human cognition might be achievable with much more subtle effects. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to certain types of electromagnetic interference. Studies had shown this, repeatedly in laboratory settings. The question wasn't whether it was possible, but whether HAARP was designed to do it. Chapter 4. Weather as a Weapon. The idea that HAARP could manipulate weather became one of the most enduring aspects of the conspiracy theory. The logic, at least on the surface, seemed plausible to those without deep knowledge of atmospheric physics. Weather is driven by energy. Solar radiation heats the surface of the Earth unevenly, creating temperature differences that drive wind, ocean currents, and storm systems. The ionosphere plays a role in this process, absorbing and redistributing energy from the sun, affecting how much solar radiation reaches the lower atmosphere. If you could heat specific regions of the ionosphere, you could theoretically create localized changes in atmospheric pressure and circulation patterns. Conspiracy researchers pointed to Eastlund's patents, which explicitly mentioned weather modification as a potential application. They cited statements from military strategists who had written about environmental warfare as a future tool of geopolitical conflict. A 1996 Air Force research paper titled "Weather as a Force Multiplier: Owning the Weather in 2045" became a frequent reference point. The document outlined hypothetical scenarios where weather control could be used to enhance military operations, disrupt enemy logistics, or create strategic advantages without firing a single shot. The paper was speculative, clearly labelled as a thought exercise about future possibilities rather than current capabilities, but its very existence proved that military planners were thinking about weather warfare. They were considering how it might be achieved, what technologies would be required, and what advantages it would provide. HAARP, theorists argued, was the secret implementation of these ideas. The facility's location in Alaska, near the Arctic jet stream, seemed deliberate. The jet stream is a river of fast-moving air that flows around the planet at high altitudes, steering weather systems across entire continents. By heating the ionosphere above that region, they claimed, operators could influence the jet stream's path. A heated section of the ionosphere could create an atmospheric bulge, a zone of altered pressure that might deflect or slow the jet stream. This, in turn, could redirect weather systems, steering storms towards some regions and away from others. Unusual weather events began to be attributed to HAARP almost immediately after the facility became operational. Severe droughts in California during the early 2000s, unprecedented flooding in the Midwest, hurricanes that shifted course unexpectedly, defying meteorologist predictions, blizzards that arrived with unusual intensity, breaking historical records. Each event for believers was evidence of invisible manipulation. The devastating Hurricane Katrina in 2005 became a focal point. The storm had intensified rapidly in the Gulf of Mexico before slamming into New Orleans with catastrophic results. Conspiracy theorists noted that HAARP had been conducting experiments during the weeks leading up to the hurricane's formation. They produced charts showing alleged correlations between HAARP activity and the storm's strengthening. They suggested the hurricane had been intentionally guided toward New Orleans, though the motives attributed to this alleged attack varied wildly depending on which conspiracy narrative you followed. The scientific community rejected these claims almost universally. Meteorologists pointed out that HAARP's energy output, while impressive by human standards, was minuscule compared to the natural forces that drive weather systems. A single hurricane contains more energy than HAARP could generate in a year of continuous operation. Heating a small section of the ionosphere for a few minutes couldn't compete with the trillions of watts of energy constantly flowing through Earth's atmosphere from the sun. Moreover, the mechanisms proposed by conspiracy theorists didn't align with established atmospheric physics. Heating the ionosphere doesn't create pressure changes in the troposphere where weather occurs. The ionosphere is too high, too thin, and too disconnected from the dense air below to directly influence storm systems. There are interactions between different atmospheric layers, but they operate on timescales and through mechanisms that don't match the rapid, targeted effects attributed to HAARP. But correlation, however flimsy, is persuasive to those who want to believe. When HAARP conducted an experiment and a hurricane intensified a week later on the other side of the continent, believers saw a connection. They created timelines, marked dates on calendars, produced graphs that seemed to show patterns. When the facility went silent for maintenance and weather patterns seemed more stable, they saw confirmation. The narrative became self-reinforcing. Videos appeared online showing HAARP's antenna array glowing at night. The visible light from control systems and security lighting transformed in the footage into something ominous and otherworldly. These images were shared thousands of times, accompanied by claims that the facility was actively manipulating a storm system or preparing for an attack. Amateur radio operators reported unusual interference during periods of extreme weather. Some claimed they could hear strange patterns in the static, rhythmic pulses that didn't match any known natural or artificial source. These recordings were analysed endlessly by conspiracy communities, with some claiming they decoded messages or identified specific frequency signatures that matched HAARP's transmission capabilities. Then there were the drought patterns. California suffered through multiple years of severe drought in the 2000s and 2010s. Water reservoirs dropped to historically low levels. Agriculture suffered. Wildfires became increasingly common and severe. Some conspiracy theorists suggested this wasn't natural climate variation or the result of climate change, but deliberate weather manipulation. By preventing storms from reaching California, by redirecting atmospheric rivers that would normally bring rain to the west coast, HAARP was allegedly being used to economically damage the state, punish its liberal politics, or force population migration. Similar theories emerge for every major weather disaster: the European heatwave of 2003, the Russian wildfires of 2010, the flooding in Pakistan that same year. Each event was analysed, connected to dates when HAARP might have been operational, and incorporated into the narrative of weather warfare. And then there were the earthquakes, which took the conspiracy to an even darker place. Chapter 5: Shaking the Earth. If weather manipulation seemed far-fetched to mainstream scientists, the earthquake theories took things to an even more extreme level. Yet they became just as widespread, if not more so, particularly in regions that had experienced devastating seismic events. The claim was this: HAARP's energy beams, directed into the ionosphere, could somehow penetrate downward into the Earth's crust. By targeting specific fault lines or tectonic boundaries with precisely modulated radio frequency energy, the facility could trigger seismic activity, earthquakes on demand, a weapon more devastating than any bomb, and one that would appear entirely natural, leaving no evidence of human involvement. The idea wasn't entirely without precedent, which gave it a veneer of plausibility. Scientists have long known that energy can influence tectonic stress. Underground nuclear tests, for example, have occasionally triggered minor seismic events in the hours or days following detonation. Deep injection of wastewater in oil and gas operations has been definitively linked to increased earthquake frequency in certain regions. The principle that adding energy to a geologically stressed system can push it past a tipping point is real and well documented. But HAARP's energy doesn't work that way, according to mainstream physics. Radio waves at the frequencies it transmits don't penetrate the Earth's surface in any meaningful way. They interact with charged particles in the ionosphere, far above the ground, and then dissipate as heat and electromagnetic radiation. There's no mechanism for those waves to transfer energy deep into the crust, let alone do so with enough precision to target a specific fault line thousands of miles away. Still, the theory spread rapidly, particularly after major seismic disasters. The devastating 2010 earthquake in Haiti, which killed over 200,000 people and left much of the capital in ruins, became an early focal point. Conspiracy theorists noted that unusual atmospheric phenomena had been reported in the days before the earthquake. Strange lights in the sky, unusual cloud formations, electromagnetic disturbances that affected radio communications. They produced charts showing alleged HAARP activity in the weeks leading up to the disaster. The theory suggested that HAARP had deliberately targeted Haiti, either as a test of earthquake weapon capabilities or as part of some geopolitical agenda. The motives attributed to this alleged attack varied. Some claimed it was a test run for future weapons deployment. Others suggested it was meant to destabilise the region for economic or political reasons. A few even claimed it was connected to oil exploration rights or attempts to establish military bases in the Caribbean. The 2011 Fukushima disaster in Japan became an even larger conspiracy narrative. The massive magnitude 9 earthquake and subsequent tsunami killed over 18,000 people and triggered a nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. It was one of the worst natural disasters in modern history, and conspiracy theorists immediately began looking for evidence of HAARP involvement. They found what they were looking for, or at least what they believed they'd found. Reports of unusual radio interference before the earthquake, atmospheric disturbances detected by satellites, allegations that HAARP had been conducting experiments at the exact time the earthquake occurred. Videos appeared online claiming to show evidence of electromagnetic disturbances in the ionosphere above Japan in the days leading up to the disaster. The 2015 Nepal earthquake, which killed nearly 9,000 people and destroyed hundreds of thousands of buildings, followed a similar pattern. Conspiracy communities analysed seismic data, atmospheric conditions, and alleged HAARP transmission schedules, producing elaborate timelines that seemed to show connections between facility activity and the disaster. Skeptics pointed out that correlation is, not causation, a basic principle of logic that seemed to hold no weight in these communities. The Earth experiences tens of thousands of earthquakes every year. The vast majority are small and cause no damage, but several dozen significant earthquakes occur annually. Finding a few that happened during periods when HAARP was operational proved nothing. It would be statistically unusual if there weren't such correlations, given how frequently both earthquakes and HAARP experiments occur. But for believers, the pattern was undeniable. They created databases cataloguing major earthquakes alongside alleged HAARP activity. They produced graphs showing what they claimed were significant correlations. They shared these materials widely, creating an evidence base that seemed convincing if you didn't look too closely at the methodology. Some theories went even further, suggesting that HAARP could be used not just to cause earthquakes but to direct tsunamis. The mechanism proposed involved creating underwater seismic events in specific locations that would generate waves travelling in predictable directions. By carefully choosing where to trigger the earthquake, operators could theoretically aim the resulting tsunami at specific coastlines while leaving others unaffected. Other variations suggested HAARP could destabilize volcanic regions, create artificial sinkholes, or even alter the Earth's magnetic field in ways that would affect tectonic processes. These theories became increasingly elaborate, incorporating elements from geology, plasma physics, and electromagnetic theory, often misunderstanding or misrepresenting the actual science involved. The facility in this telling was a tool of geophysical warfare capable of reshaping the planet's surface at will, a weapon that could destroy cities without leaving fingerprints, that could be used to punish enemy nations or destabilize regions targeted for regime change, all while maintaining plausible deniability. After all, earthquakes are natural. They happen all the time. How could anyone prove that a particular earthquake was artificially triggered rather than a random act of geology? No credible scientific evidence supported any of these claims. Seismologists who studied the earthquakes in question found nothing unusual about them. They occurred along known fault lines, in regions with documented seismic risk, and displayed characteristics entirely consistent with natural tectonic processes. The energy required to trigger a major earthquake is so enormous that even nuclear weapons can only produce relatively minor seismic events. HAARP's power output is orders of magnitude smaller than a nuclear weapon. But the lack of evidence didn't stop the theories from spreading. If anything, it reinforced them. The absence of proof, believers argued, was itself proof. If HAARP's true capabilities were being hidden, if the technology was classified and the operations were conducted in secret, then of course there would be no public data confirming them. The lack of transparency was the transparency. The denial was the admission. And so the earthquake conspiracy became a permanent fixture of the HAARP narrative, impossible to disprove because it was structured to treat all contradicting evidence as confirmation of the cover-up. Chapter 6. Frequencies of the Mind. But the darkest theories surrounding HAARP, the ones that provoke the deepest unease and the most intense speculation, had nothing to do with weather or earthquakes. They had to do with the human brain. The idea was rooted in the undeniable fact that the brain operates electrically. Neurons communicate through electrical impulses, generating electromagnetic fields that can be measured with sensitive equipment. Thoughts, emotions, perceptions, consciousness itself. All of it arises from patterns of electrical activity firing across billions of cells in intricate networks. And electrical activity can be influenced by external, electromagnetic fields. This isn't speculation, it's established neuroscience. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, for example, uses powerful magnetic fields to influence brain activity, treating depression and other neurological conditions. Deep brain stimulation implants use electrical pulses to modify neural firing patterns in patients with Parkinson's disease. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to electromagnetic influences. Conspiracy theorists pointed to decades of research into the effects of electromagnetic radiation on human cognition and behavior. Studies conducted throughout the Cold War had shown that exposure to certain frequencies could alter mood, induce sleep, cause disorientation, or produce feelings of anxiety. Extremely low frequency waves in particular had been shown to penetrate the human skull and interact with brainwave patterns more effectively than higher frequencies. Military researchers in both the United States and Soviet Union had explored these effects extensively. Declassified documents from the Cold War era revealed experiments where subjects were exposed to various electromagnetic frequencies to determine if their behavior could be modified. Some studies showed measurable changes in reaction time, mood, and cognitive function. Others were inconclusive or showed only subtle effects, but the research demonstrated that the concept wasn't pseudoscience. The brain could be influenced electromagnetically. HAARP, theorists claimed, was capable of broadcasting such frequencies on a massive scale. Not directly, but through a process called modulation. The facility's high-frequency transmissions couldn't directly affect the brain. They operated at frequencies far too high for neurons to respond to. But by pulsing those high-frequency transmissions in specific patterns, HAARP could create extremely low-frequency waves in the ionosphere itself. Here's how it would work, according to the theory. HAARP's powerful transmitter sends radio waves into the ionosphere, heating the charged particles there. By rapidly modulating the heating on and off, by pulsing the energy at extremely low frequencies, perhaps between 1 and 100 cycles per second, you could make the entire heated region of the ionosphere vibrate at that same low frequency. The ionosphere would act like a giant speaker membrane, generating extremely low-frequency electromagnetic waves that would propagate downward through the atmosphere. Unlike the high-frequency carrier signal, these extremely low-frequency waves could penetrate deep into the Earth, through mountains and oceans, and through human tissue including the brain. They're the same frequencies at which human brainwaves operate. Delta waves during deep sleep, theta waves during meditation, alpha waves during relaxed wakefulness, beta waves during active thinking. If you could broadcast a signal at the right frequency, with the right pattern, could you influence which brainwave state people experienced? The implications were beyond chilling. If you could broadcast a frequency that induced fear, you could incapacitate an enemy population without firing a shot. Imagine an entire city gripped by inexplicable terror, unable to think clearly, unable to organize resistance. If you could broadcast a frequency that induced compliance or suggestibility, you could control public behavior during times of unrest. Protests could be dispersed not with tear gas and batons, but with an invisible signal that made people docile, cooperative, eager to follow instructions. If you could broadcast a frequency that disrupted concentration or memory, you could undermine a rival nation's workforce and military effectiveness. Students couldn't study, workers couldn't focus, soldiers couldn't execute complex operations. The economic and military consequences would be devastating, and the cause would be invisible, undetectable without specialized equipment. This wasn't just wild speculation. The concept had historical roots that conspiracy theorists traced back to the Cold War. During that era, both the United States and the Soviet Union conducted research into psychotronic weapons, devices designed to influence human cognition through electromagnetic means. The Soviets allegedly developed systems capable of inducing hallucinations, paranoia, and physical discomfort in targeted individuals. Some of these systems were supposedly tested on dissidents, political prisoners, and even foreign diplomats. The United States explored similar technologies under various classified programs. Some of this research was connected to MKUltra, the CIA's notorious mind control experiments. While most of MKUltra focused on chemical methods, primarily LSD and other drugs, some branches of the program investigated electromagnetic approaches. Declassified documents confirmed this, though the details remained heavily redacted. HAARP, in this framework, was the next evolution, a system capable of broadcasting mind-altering frequencies not to a single target in a laboratory or prison cell, but to entire regions, whole cities, potentially even larger areas, depending on ionospheric conditions and the power levels employed. A silent weapon that could turn populations against themselves, erode trust between communities, amplify existing divisions and conflicts, and destabilize societies from within without anyone understanding what was happening to them. There were anecdotal reports, though unverified and impossible to confirm, of people living near the HAARP facility experiencing unusual symptoms during active transmission periods. Severe headaches that came on suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. Episodes of vertigo and disorientation. Unexplained anxiety and feelings of dread that had no apparent cause. Auditory hallucinations typically described as low humming or buzzing sounds that seemed to come from inside their heads rather than from any external source. Skeptics attributed these to environmental factors, the stress of living in an isolated community, the psychological impact of knowing about the facility and its controversial reputation. The power of suggestion is real. If you expect to feel strange during certain times, if you're anxiously monitoring your own mental state for signs of external influence, you can create symptoms through expectation alone. This is basic psychology, well documented in countless studies. But for those who experienced these symptoms, the explanations felt inadequate. The headaches were too sudden, too severe, the vertigo too disorienting. the anxiety too intense to be mere imagination. They felt like something external was affecting them, invading their minds, disrupting normal brain function. Some tried to document the pattern, keeping logs of when they felt symptoms and comparing them to information about HAARP's operational schedule. The facility didn't publish detailed transmission logs, but some operational. Data was available through FOIA requests or leaked through various channels. A few people claimed they'd found correlations, that their symptoms reliably appeared during periods when HAARP was known to be active and disappeared when the facility was shut down. These accounts circulated through conspiracy communities, collected and analysed for patterns. Some researchers tried to map symptom reports geographically, looking for concentrations that might indicate where HAARP's effects were strongest. Others investigated whether certain individuals might be more sensitive to electromagnetic fields, more susceptible to whatever HAARP was allegedly broadcasting. And then there was the connection to an older, darker program, one that proved the government had already experimented with mind control, one that showed they were willing to destroy lives in pursuit of that goal, a program whose shadow still loomed over every conspiracy theory about secret government operations. Chapter 7. The shadow of MKUltra. MKUltra was real. That much is not disputed by anyone, not even the most skeptical debunkers of conspiracy theories. Declassified documents, congressional testimony, and investigative journalism have all confirmed that the Central Intelligence Agency conducted illegal experiments on unwitting American citizens throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The goal was to develop methods of mind control, techniques that could break down an individual's will, implant false memories, induce compliance, or extract information without the subject being aware of what had been done to them. The program used drugs, primarily LSD and other hallucinogens, administered to subjects without their knowledge or consent. It used sensory deprivation chambers, where subjects would be isolated in darkness and silence for days or weeks, their minds gradually deteriorating under the stress. It used psychological torture, carefully calibrated to maximize suffering while minimizing visible physical injury. It used electroshock therapy, sometimes at levels far beyond what was medically justified, scrambling memories and personalities. The program destroyed lives. Some subjects were left permanently damaged, their minds fractured by the experiments conducted on them, unable to function in normal society. A few committed suicide, driven to desperation by symptoms they couldn't understand, and no one would help them treat. Others lived for decades not knowing what had been done to them, suffering mysterious psychological problems whose true cause remained hidden in classified files. The program was officially shut down in the early 1970s, after journalists began investigating rumours of CIA experiments. The agency's director ordered MKUltra's records destroyed to prevent them from being discovered during congressional investigations. Most of the documentation was successfully eliminated, but some survived, enough to piece together the broad outlines of what had been done. Congressional hearings in the mid-1970s exposed the program to public scrutiny for the first time. Victims testified about their experiences, though many were dismissed as unreliable due to their psychological problems that were themselves caused by the experiments. The CIA admitted to some activities, but downplayed the scope and severity, claiming the program had been an unfortunate but limited aberration, a product of Cold War paranoia that would never be repeated. But conspiracy theorists argue that MKUltra didn't end. It evolved, went deeper underground, adopted new methods that were harder to trace. The chemical methods were crude, unpredictable, difficult to scale beyond individual subjects or small groups. They left evidence, medical records, drug supplies, testimony from subjects who survived. But electromagnetic methods, those offered something entirely different. Precision without physical contact, repeatability without chemical trails, the ability to affect large populations without anyone knowing they'd been targeted. HAARP, in this interpretation, was the spiritual and technological successor to MKUltra, a system designed not to control individuals in laboratory settings, but to influence masses of people in their normal environments. No drugs required, no physical detention, No face-to-face interaction, just electromagnetic fields propagating invisibly through the atmosphere, subtly altering the electrical activity in millions of brains simultaneously. The theory suggested that the lessons learned from MKUltra, how certain chemical compounds could induce altered states of consciousness, how sensory deprivation affected mental stability, how repeated trauma could break down personality structures, were applied to electromagnetic research. Scientists asked new questions. Could electromagnetic fields replicate the effects of LSD without the need for chemical administration? Could they induce sensory deprivation by disrupting normal brain processing of sensory information? Could they create psychological stress by interfering with the neural circuits that regulate emotion? Preliminary research, some of it published in obscure journals, some of it allegedly classified, suggested the answer might be yes. Electromagnetic fields at certain frequencies could influence neurotransmitter release. They could affect the blood-brain barrier's permeability, potentially altering which substances reach neural tissue. They could interfere with calcium channels in nerve cells, changing how neurons fired and communicated with each other. This aligned with another persistent conspiracy belief, that global elites, shadowy governments, or secret organizations sought to control humanity through invisible means. Not through overt force, which creates resistance and rebellion, but through subtle manipulation that people don't recognize as external influence, make the population anxious enough that they demand security measures, make them distracted enough that they don't notice their rights eroding, make them divided enough that they fight each other instead of questioning those in power. HAARP fit perfectly into that narrative, a hidden facility funded by military agencies whose budgets are largely classified, conducting experiments that were never fully disclosed to the public, possessing capabilities that sounded like science fiction, but were grounded in real, documented physics. Located in one of the most remote regions of North America, far from oversight, far from journalists who might ask inconvenient questions. No direct evidence linked HAARP to mind control experiments of the type conducted under MKUltra. No whistleblowers came forward with first-hand accounts of such programs. No documents were leaked describing cognitive influence operations. No victims testified about being targeted by electromagnetic weapons based at the facility. But the absence of evidence once, again, was interpreted as concealment. If the program was classified at the highest levels, if its true purpose was hidden behind layers of compartmentalization and security clearances, if the operators had learned from MKUltra's mistake of leaving paper trails, then of course there would be no proof. The technology was invisible, the effects were subtle, the deniability was perfect, and so the theory persisted. It evolved, merging with other conspiracies. It became a foundational element of a broader belief system that saw invisible forces manipulating reality itself. HAARP wasn't just a weather weapon or an earthquake generator. It was a consciousness control grid, a tool for reshaping human thought and behaviour on a planetary scale. Chapter 8. Lights in the Sky. For those living near Gakona, for the handful of families and individuals who made their homes in that remote region of Alaska, HAARP was impossible to ignore. Not because of its antennas, which were visible but static, standing silently most of the time, but because of what happened when the facility powered on. Witnesses reported strange lights in the sky, phenomena that appeared with such consistency during HAARP operations that even skeptics couldn't dismiss them entirely. Glowing patches of green, red and purple light would appear in the night sky, rippling and shifting like auroras, but behaving in ways that natural auroras never did. They would appear in locations where auroras shouldn't be visible at all, too far south or at times when solar activity was minimal. They would pulse in rhythm, brightening and fading with a regularity that seemed too precise to be random. Scientists explain this as ionospheric luminescence, a known and well-documented side effect of ionospheric heating experiments. When HAARP's energy beams excited electrons in the upper atmosphere, those electrons would absorb the radio frequency energy and move to higher energy states. When they eventually released that energy and returned to their normal states, they would emit photons, particles of light, in the visible spectrum. The result was artificial auroras, human-made light shows created by concentrated electromagnetic energy. The colours depended on which gases were being excited and at what altitudes. Green light typically came from oxygen at lower ionospheric altitudes. Red came from oxygen at higher altitudes. Purple and blue came from nitrogen. By carefully controlling the frequency and power of its transmissions, HAARP could theoretically create auroras in specific colours, though whether this was intentional or merely a side effect of the heating process remained unclear. For scientists, these artificial auroras were fascinating. They provided visual confirmation that the heating was working, that energy was being deposited where intended, that the ionosphere was responding as predicted. Researchers would sometimes photograph these auroras, publishing the images in scientific papers or presenting them at conferences as examples of successful experiments. But for those who witnessed them without understanding the mechanism, the lights were deeply unsettling. They didn't behave like normal auroras. Natural auroras flow across the sky, curtains of light that dance and shimmer with organic randomness. HAARP's auroras appeared suddenly in isolated patches, remained stationary or moved in geometrically precise ways, and disappeared just as abruptly when the transmission ended. Some described them as feeling wrong, as if the sky itself had been broken, torn open to reveal something underneath that humans weren't meant to see. The lights had an artificial quality, a sense of being manufactured rather than natural, that provoked unease even in people who didn't believe in conspiracy theories. There were other reports beyond the visible lights. Radio interference that disrupted CB radios, ham radio operators, and even some commercial broadcasts during HAARP operations. Electronic devices malfunctioning without explanation, particularly older equipment that wasn't well shielded against electromagnetic interference. Compasses spinning erratically, the needles refusing to settle on magnetic north, instead wandering in confused circles. These effects were consistent with the electromagnetic disturbances HAARP was designed to create. Radio frequency interference was expected when you're pumping billions of watts of radio energy into the atmosphere. Electronic malfunctions were predictable when strong electromagnetic fields were present. Compass disruption made sense if the facility was affecting local geomagnetic conditions. But for people experiencing these effects without the benefit of scientific explanation, they reinforced the sense that something unnatural was happening. Their technology was being affected by invisible forces. The fundamental laws of nature, like magnetic north, seemed temporarily suspended. Reality itself felt less stable during HAARP operations. Pilots flying near the region occasionally reported unusual atmospheric phenomena that went beyond simple radio interference. Sudden turbulence in otherwise clear skies, powerful enough to jolt aircraft without warning. Visual distortions that made it difficult to judge altitude or distance, particularly when looking upward toward where HAARP's beams would be heating the ionosphere. Strange readings on navigation instruments, compass headings that didn't match GPS data, altimeters giving inconsistent readings. Most of these incidents were attributed to natural ionospheric variability. Alaska is at high latitude, where the ionosphere is naturally more active and unpredictable than at lower latitudes. Solar storms regularly create disturbances that can affect communications and navigation. The aurora borealis itself is evidence of these natural processes at work. But a few incidents remained unexplained even after investigation. Aircraft that experienced severe turbulence with no meteorological cause, navigation systems that failed in ways that didn't match any known technical problem. A handful of pilots reported feeling disoriented or experiencing what they described as vertigo or spatial confusion during flights near Gakona, symptoms that disappeared once they left the area. These reports were never officially connected to HAARP. The facility's operators maintained that their transmissions couldn't affect aircraft systems, that all experiments were conducted with aviation safety in mind, that any coincidental timing was exactly that, coincidence. The Federal Aviation Administration found no evidence of safety hazards related to the facility. And then there were the sounds. This was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the reports, the one that even many skeptics found difficult to dismiss entirely. Low-frequency hums that some people claimed to hear during active experiments. Not everyone heard them. Many residents near the facility never experienced anything unusual. But for those who did, the experience was profoundly disturbing. The sound was typically described as a deep, resonant tone. Not loud, but persistent. Felt as much as heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Impossible to localize. Some compared it to the hum of distant machinery, others to a musical note held indefinitely, still others to something entirely unlike any normal sound. The tone would last for minutes or hours, then fade away gradually when HAARP presumably stopped transmitting. These sounds, if real and not psychosomatic, might have been caused by extremely low frequency waves propagating through the atmosphere. Such waves can vibrate structures, cause them to resonate at frequencies that become faintly audible. Windows, walls, even the human skull itself might vibrate in response to powerful electromagnetic fields, creating sounds that only some people can perceive, or the sounds might have been direct, stimulation of the auditory system. The inner ear contains hair cells that convert mechanical vibrations into electrical signals the brain interprets as sound. These cells are sensitive to electromagnetic fields. Strong fields, particularly at certain frequencies, can make hair cells fire without any actual sound waves present, creating auditory sensations that seem real but have no external acoustic source. Or they might have been entirely imaginary, the mind creating sensations to match anxiety and fear. The power of suggestion is extraordinary. If you believe you're being exposed to dangerous electromagnetic radiation, if you expect to experience unusual symptoms, your brain can obligingly produce them. But for those who heard the hums, explanations about psychosomatic effects or electromagnetic stimulation of hair cells offered little comfort. The sound felt external, real, unnatural. It felt like evidence that something was reaching down from the sky, penetrating their homes, entering their bodies, doing something to them that they couldn't see or understand but could definitely feel. Chapter 9. The Military's Interest. One aspect of HAARP that even mainstream sources, even official government documents acknowledged was its military utility. The facility was, after all, funded and operated jointly by the United States Air Force and United States Navy, with additional involvement from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Defense applications were always part of the program from its inception. This wasn't hidden or denied. It was stated openly. The official list of military interests included several legitimate and scientifically sound applications. Submarine communication was a major focus. Extremely low-frequency waves can penetrate deep into seawater, something higher frequency radio waves cannot do. A submarine cruising at depth is effectively cut off from normal communications, unable to receive or send messages without coming close to the surface and extending an antenna. But extremely low-frequency waves can reach submarines hundreds of feet down, allowing contact with vessels that would otherwise be unreachable. HAARP's ability to generate such waves by modulating its ionospheric heating made it valuable for submarine communications research. By understanding how to create more efficient, extremely low-frequency signals, how to encode data into those signals despite their limited bandwidth, how to minimize interference and maximize range, the Navy could improve its ability to communicate with its submarine fleet anywhere in the world's oceans. Over-the-horizon radar was another stated military application. Normally, radar is limited by line of sight. Radio waves travel in straight lines, so a radar station can only detect objects up to the horizon, beyond which the Earth's curvature blocks the signal. But by bouncing radar signals off the ionosphere, operators could detect objects far beyond the line of sight, potentially thousands of miles away. The effectiveness of over-the-horizon radar depends heavily on ionospheric conditions. Changes in electron density, temperature, or electromagnetic properties affect how well the ionosphere reflects radar signals. Understanding these factors, learning how to predict ionospheric behavior, or even modify it to improve radar performance, could provide significant military advantages. Early warning of missile launches, detection of aircraft or ships at extreme ranges, monitoring of adversary military movements all become possible with effective over-the-horizon radar. Signal disruption was a third acknowledged military interest. In a conflict, the ability to jam or degrade an enemy's communications and GPS systems could provide decisive advantages. Modern military operations depend heavily on satellite communications, precision navigation, and real-time data sharing. Disrupt those capabilities and you blind your opponent, force them to operate with outdated information, reduce their ability to coordinate complex operations. Ionospheric heating could create disturbances that interfered with satellite signals or radio transmissions. By heating a region of the ionosphere above an enemy's territory, by creating localized zones of intense electromagnetic activity, HAARP or similar systems could potentially disrupt communications across wide areas. The disturbances would be temporary, lasting only as long as the heating continued, but that might be enough to provide tactical advantages during critical phases of an operation. All of these applications were legitimate, scientifically sound, and openly discussed in HAARP's published research. Congressional testimony about the facility mentioned these purposes. Academic papers detailed experiments testing these concepts. There was no conspiracy here, just straightforward military research into technologies that had obvious defense value. But conspiracy theorists saw these acknowledged applications as merely the tip of the iceberg. If the military was willing to disclose submarine communications, over-the-horizon radar, and signal disruption, what else were they working on that remained classified? What capabilities existed beyond what was publicly admitted? The line between research and weaponization is often thin, sometimes non-existent. Technologies developed for one purpose can easily be adapted for another. A system designed to study atmospheric behavior can also be used to disrupt it. A facility built to improve communications can be used to destroy communications. And a tool capable of heating the ionosphere to enhance radar can, in theory, be turned into something far more dangerous. History provided ample precedent for dual-use technologies being weaponized despite initial claims that they were purely for research or peaceful purposes. Nuclear technology was developed for power generation and medical applications, but its primary use has been military. Chemical research produced pesticides and pharmaceuticals, but also nerve agents and biological weapons. Satellite technology enables GPS, weather forecasting, and global communications, but also precision-guided munitions and surveillance systems that can read license plates from orbit. Why would HAARP be any different? Why trust that a military-funded facility, operated by defense agencies, was limiting itself to benign applications when the same technology could theoretically be used for weather manipulation, earthquake generation, and cognitive influence? There were no confirmed reports of HAARP being used in active military operations, no instances documented in any public source where the facility was deployed to jam enemy signals during a conflict or trigger environmental events as part of a military campaign. No battles where HAARP's influence was apparent, no wars where weather suddenly shifted in suspicious ways that benefited American forces, but the absence of such reports didn't mean they hadn't happened. Classified programs by definition remain hidden. Special access programs, the most secretive military activities, operate with such tight compartmentalization that even high-ranking officials may not know they exist. If HAARP had been used operationally, if experiments had been conducted on live targets during actual conflicts, those facts could easily remain classified indefinitely. Conspiracy theorists pointed to various conflicts where unusual weather patterns or atmospheric phenomena had been observed. The Gulf War in the early 1990s, when unusual electromagnetic disturbances were reported. Military operations in the Balkans during the late 1990s, when severe weather sometimes seemed to coincide with NATO bombing campaigns. The Iraq War in the early 2000s, when sandstorms arrived at suspiciously opportune moments for American forces. Were these natural coincidences the kind of weather variability that occurs in any military conflict over any extended period? Or were they evidence of classified weather modification operations using HAARP or similar systems? The data was ambiguous enough that both interpretations seemed possible, depending on your prior beliefs about what governments were capable of and willing to do. And even if HAARP itself had never been used as a weapon, its existence proved that such weapons were possible. It demonstrated that humanity had reached a point where the atmosphere itself could be manipulated, where invisible forces could be directed with precision across vast distances, where the boundary between nature and technology had become so blurred as to be meaningless. That alone was enough to fuel endless speculation about what might be happening beyond public view. Chapter 10: Closure and Continuity. In May of 2014, the Air Force announced that HAARP would be shut down. The decision sent shockwaves through conspiracy communities and raised questions even among mainstream observers who had followed the facility's operations. Funding had been cut, the Air Force explained. The program had accomplished its research goals. The facility was no longer needed for current military priorities. It would be dismantled unless another organisation stepped in to take over operations. The announcement was matter-of-fact, bureaucratic, offering no dramatic explanations or acknowledgements of the controversies that had surrounded HAARP since its inception. For conspiracy theorists, this was a moment of vindication mixed with suspicion. HAARP had become too visible, too controversial, too much of a liability. Shutting it down was a way to end the scrutiny, to move the program elsewhere or transition it into deeper secrecy, where public awareness and amateur investigations couldn't reach. The timing seemed suspicious. HAARP had supposedly achieved its research goals, but ionospheric science is an ongoing field with countless unanswered questions. Why shut down the world's most powerful ionospheric research facility just when it could be producing the most valuable data? Why abandon decades of investment and infrastructure? The answers offered by officials seemed inadequate. Budget pressures affect all military programs, but HAARP's costs were relatively modest compared to weapon systems or major research initiatives. If the facility was genuinely valuable for submarine communications or over-the-horizon radar, why wouldn't the Navy or Air Force find funding to keep it operational? Some theorists suggested the shutdown was cover for transitioning HAARP's capabilities to mobile platforms. Perhaps the lessons learned from the Alaska facility had been applied to ship-based or aircraft-mounted systems that could be deployed anywhere in the world. Mobile ionospheric heaters wouldn't attract the same attention as a fixed installation. They could be moved between locations, used briefly, and then relocated before anyone noticed unusual atmospheric or environmental effects. Others speculated about satellite-based systems. Several patents existed for space-based ionospheric heaters, designs that would use solar panels for power and could maintain position over specific regions of Earth for extended periods. Such systems would be difficult to detect, impossible for the public to visit or monitor, and could operate continuously without the limitations imposed by ground-based facilities. Still others believed the real program had simply gone black, moved into special access programs that operated with no public oversight whatsoever. The Alaska facility had been the unclassified face of ionospheric warfare research. Behind that facade, they argued, much more advanced systems had been developed and deployed using technologies that made HAARP look primitive by comparison. But the shutdown didn't last long, and what happened next complicated these narratives in ways that conspiracy theorists struggled to explain. In August of 2015, control of HAARP was transferred to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The facility would remain operational, but now under academic oversight rather than military control. Research would continue, but with an emphasis on transparency and collaboration with the broader scientific community. The university embraced openness in ways the military never had. They opened the facility to public tours, allowing visitors to see the antennas up close, enter the control buildings, and meet the researchers conducting experiments. They published detailed explanations of ongoing projects on public websites. They hosted open houses where community members could ask questions and observe operations. They invited journalists to visit, encouraging media coverage that would demystify the facility and explain its actual scientific purpose. For mainstream scientists, this was an entirely positive development. It demonstrated that HAARP was exactly what it claimed to be, a research station studying ionospheric physics. The transparency provided by university control addressed many of the concerns that had fueled conspiracy theories. If the facility had been developing weapons or conducting mind control experiments, surely the university wouldn't be giving tours and publishing their research methods. But for believers in the conspiracy, the transfer meant nothing, or even confirmed their worst suspicions. If HAARP's true purpose had always been classified, if the facility had been conducting secret experiments alongside its public research, then handing it over to a university was simply the next phase of the cover-up. The real programs, they argued, had been moved elsewhere before the transfer. The sensitive equipment had been removed, the classified experiments had been shut down, and what the university inherited was just an empty shell. A theatre set designed to look like a research facility, functional enough to conduct basic, atmospheric experiments that would satisfy academic oversight, but stripped of whatever capabilities had made it truly dangerous. This interpretation required believing that hundreds of scientists and engineers who now worked at the facility under university control were either ignorant of its former classified programs or complicit in maintaining the cover-up. It required believing that the tours and open houses were elaborate deceptions, showing visitors legitimate equipment while hiding the real capabilities. It required a conspiracy so vast and so perfectly maintained that no one had ever leaked information despite years of opportunities to do so. The conspiracy theory had reached a point where it was essentially unfalsifiable. Evidence against it was interpreted as evidence for it. Transparency was proof of deception. Openness was proof of concealment. The more the university tried to demonstrate HAARP's benign nature, the more conspiracy theorists saw confirmation that something was being hidden. Some believers pointed to the fact that the antennas remained standing, that the facility still operated, as proof that it could be reactivated for classified purposes at any time. Perhaps the military had only handed over day-to-day control while retaining the ability to take command during emergencies or for special operations. Perhaps the university scientists were unknowing cover, conducting real research that served as camouflage for occasional classified experiments. Others insisted the entire Alaska facility had become irrelevant, that whatever HAARP had proven could be done was now being done better elsewhere by systems the public knew nothing about. The antenna field in Gakona was a distraction, they claimed, drawing attention and conspiracy theories while the real ionospheric warfare programs operated in complete secrecy. There was no evidence for these claims, no leaked documents, no whistleblower testimony, no unexplained facilities appearing in satellite, imagery or budget documents. But absence of evidence had long since ceased to matter in the HAARP conspiracy narrative. Epilogue. The sky as a weapon. Stand outside on a clear night and look up. The stars scattered across the darkness. The moon casting its pale light. The vast emptiness of space stretching out beyond human comprehension. For most of human history, the sky was untouchable, a mystery that could only be observed, studied, wondered about, but never controlled or altered by mortal hands. But HAARP proved something fundamental. It proved that humanity had reached a point where even the atmosphere itself, even the ionosphere floating at the edge of space, could be modified by human technology, where energy could be focused and directed with precision across hundreds of miles, where the invisible forces that govern weather, communication, and potentially even consciousness could be manipulated by those with sufficient knowledge and resources. Whether HAARP was ever used for weather control, earthquake generation, or mind manipulation remains a matter of belief rather than proven fact. The evidence is ambiguous, fragmentary, open to interpretation. The official explanations are scientifically plausible and supported by mainstream physics. The conspiracy theories are compelling to many but lack the concrete proof that would convince skeptics. But certain facts are undeniable, regardless of which narrative you believe. The facility existed. 180 antennas generating billions of watts of focused electromagnetic energy. Real hardware, real physics, real effects on the ionosphere that could be measured and observed. The patents existed. Bernard Eastland's designs for atmospheric modification, weather manipulation, and geophysical warfare applications. Detailed technical specifications that described exactly how such systems might work. The military interest existed. Documented, acknowledged, openly discussed applications for submarine, communications, over-the-horizon radar, and signal disruption, defense funding, military operators, strategic research goals. The research into electromagnetic effects on human cognition existed. Decades of Cold War experiments, declassified documents, scientific papers showing that brainwaves can be influenced by external electromagnetic fields. All of these pieces are real. The question that divides believers from skeptics isn't whether these technologies and capabilities are theoretically possible. The physics suggests they are, even if implementing them at the scale and with the precision required would be extraordinarily difficult. The question is whether they were actually deployed, whether HAARP or similar systems were ever used for purposes beyond academic research, whether the conspiracy theories describe reality or paranoid fantasy. And that question may never be answered definitively. Classified programs remain classified. Secret operations stay secret. If HAARP was used as a weapon, if ionospheric warfare has been conducted, if minds have been influenced or weather patterns altered by invisible electromagnetic beams, the evidence would be circumstantial at best, ambiguous, deniable, impossible to prove beyond reasonable doubt. The antennas in Gakona still stand. They still transmit during experiments, heating the ionosphere, creating artificial auroras, advancing humanity's understanding of how the upper atmosphere behaves. University researchers publish their findings in academic journals. Students conduct thesis research using the facility's unique capabilities. The scientific work continues, transparent and peer-reviewed. But somewhere in the back of your mind, a question may linger, a doubt that won't quite disappear no matter how many official explanations you read or scientific papers you review. Are the skies above us entirely natural, or have they become something else? A canvas for invisible experimentation that continues beyond public view. A battlefield for silent wars fought with weapons most people don't know exist. A medium through which minds might be subtly influenced, weather patterns carefully steered, reality itself shaped by those who control the right frequencies broadcast from the right locations. The next time you see strange lights in the sky, colours that shimmer and pulse with unnatural regularity, ask yourself whether you're witnessing natural auroras or something manufactured. The next time a storm shifts course unexpectedly, defying meteorologist predictions, consider whether you're seeing chaos theory at work or deliberate manipulation. The next time you feel an emotion you can't quite explain, an anxiety or unease that seems to come from nowhere, wonder whether it originates in your own mind or in electromagnetic fields propagating invisibly through the atmosphere around you. These questions don't have easy answers. Maybe they don't have answers at all. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the uncomfortable, middle ground between official denial and conspiracy belief. Maybe some of what Harpy was accused of was real, while other accusations were paranoid exaggeration. Maybe the facility studied the ionosphere while simultaneously testing capabilities that were never publicly acknowledged. Or maybe it was always exactly what it claimed to be: a research station, a scientific instrument, a tool for understanding the mysterious region where Earth's atmosphere transitions into the vacuum of space. Nothing more sinister than that. You'll have to decide for yourself what you believe. Look at the evidence. Consider the arguments from both sides. Apply whatever standards of proof you think are appropriate. But remember that the sky above you, that vast blue dome that seems so empty and peaceful, contains forces and phenomena that humanity is only beginning to understand. And where there is incomplete understanding, where there are capabilities that sound like science fiction but might be science, fact, there will always be room for doubt. Thanks for listening to this journey into one of modern conspiracy theory's most enduring mysteries. Whatever you believe about HAARP, whatever conclusions you draw from the facts and speculation we've explored tonight, remember to think critically, question official narratives without falling into paranoia, and remain open to the possibility that reality might be stranger and more complex than any single explanation can capture. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to leave a review on Spotify, comment with your location and time zone, and subscribe for more investigations into the mysteries that lurk at the edges of accepted knowledge. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep looking up at the sky with fresh eyes.